Hello, I'm Sam Jones, and the program you're about to see may surprise you. You know, you and I live in a very fast-moving and sometimes hectic world, and many times we fail to notice what's going on right next to us. Very often, discoveries of something we've missed along the way are greeted with a degree of skepticism. But those things, as some choose to call them, are important, because like it or not, they make up this world of ours, and because of that, they have their place. Right here in Oklahoma, there lives a group or body of people who actually walk in two different worlds, theirs and the world of the non-Indian, where the phrase, "I'll see you in the morning," means sunrise, not 9:30 or 10. Now, in a very general sense, they are American Indians. If you come in a little bit closer, they are Cherokee. And if you're specific, well, what you're about to see has never been recorded by television cameras, although it flourishes now in rural Oklahoma. Much has been written about the Cherokee Indians, and a great deal is known about the early Cherokee lifestyle. But this is not the story of the Cherokee. It is about what many consider to be their main religious body, the original Kituwa Society. Shrouded in secrecy, suspect by those weak in their own faith, and very often accused of voodoo or even witchcraft by non-believers. This is the first documentation of this religious order, and it was conducted with the help and the cooperation of its leaders and its membership. Now, some of the scenes you're about to see were taped using only a few bare light bulbs, and much of the language is Cherokee. The Kituwas are bilingual, and Cherokee is the language of their ceremonies. Now, in the beginning, we thought this project would be completed in a month, perhaps even 2 at the most. Well, in fact, we spent a year and a half documenting their religious practices, moving at the pace that they set, and one that allowed us to actually learn from them of the old ways. It is the first known view of their secret ceremonies and their closely guarded artifacts. But you can't videotape beliefs. Even so, by the end of this hour, I think you will have a feeling for their beliefs, and that is important. So in a moment, we'll take you to the beginning of our search for the Kituwas and share with you what we learned along the way in Spirit of the Fire. I don't have to tell you that in today's world, the sights and sounds are all just about the same. But we are different, each one of us. Still, in many ways, we're all the same. And one day each week, many of us come together, in part, because of that.
Let us pray. Dear Father,
some come together in different places, but they all pray in the same direction. Sunday morning, rural southeast Oklahoma, and one of the oldest religious sites in this part of the country. As civilization began to claw its way westward, Cherokee Indians would be found living in caves and settings similar to this village reproduction at Jollagee in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. They fished, hunted, and trapped for food and clothing. They also farmed, which in addition to providing food, gave them barter for trade. With the passing of time, victorious hunts and battles against man and the elements went unrecorded. Word of mouth or drawings kept some of those stories alive. Others were handed down to the young by their parents and by tribal elders. Somewhere, though, in those early years, it's thought the crude formation of a religious fellowship or doctrine of sorts began. Because it wasn't recorded as it occurred, the actual time frame isn't known. This man, Sequoyah, gave them a means by which to record events, the Sequoyah Cherokee alphabet. Today, there are records of tribal events, births, deaths, and the like. Many of those records, though, are gathering dust in libraries and museums. But the records of the original Kituwa Society aren't among them. Those records will be found here, where the religious fellowship lives today, in the foothills of southeast Oklahoma. Well, the Kituwas may live here, but so do thousands of other Cherokees, and not all of them are members. A great many years ago, there were secret greetings when members met, a special way of gripping the coat lapel, or perhaps a tilt of the hat. Now, the latter prompted the nickname Pinhead Indians by some whites in the late 1800s. Even though I'm a native of this part of the country, I had no idea how difficult it would be, first to locate the Kituwas, and second, to obtain permission to invade their territory with camera crews and microphones. Well, our search took us here. The organization's bylaws, first written down about 1859, call for a stomp ground where members could practice their faith. This one, the old Stokes Grounds near Vian, Oklahoma, was established just after the beginning of the Trail of Tears. There would be many others, but this would be the main one. Today, it's federally protected land and open to all who care to stop by. We did, and walked these grounds in the early summer of 1982. There's a fireplace, long cold, but there was a time when dancers moved about this once holy place, singing and dancing and celebrating life, paying tribute to the Great Spirit. 7 arbors, one for each of the clans of the original society, stand in a circle around the fire. Empty now, rebuilt many times over the years, they now stand as mute tributes to the thousands of sermons once preached here. Stickball. Although many cultures enjoyed the game, the Kituwas also played it during those early years in Tennessee and Carolina. But for many years, these grounds would vibrate with the activities of those games. The council hut, the medicine fire, cooking and meeting arbor, and the water well. All of the physical ingredients needed and called for in the Kituwa bylaws. And from time to time, usually a Saturday night, somebody builds a fire here, and there might even be some dancing. But the Kituwas abandoned this ground years ago. For them, this ground is dead. In July of '82, the search brought us here to an undisclosed location in southeast Oklahoma where the Kituwas decided through much prayer and meditation to relocate their grounds. This sign at the gate, the conduct rule, in Cherokee and English, it is strictly enforced. There would be many visits to this area with no camera crew, requesting permission to do the story. And it was during one of those visits that I first stepped back into the 15, possibly the 1400s. I had asked to address the chief, the councilmen, the elders and medicine men in the old way. Well, permission for that was granted. The meeting was held on a Sunday morning about 1 a.m. Their council meeting was already underway in this hut when the door opened and I was taken in. Alone with those tribal leaders in that setting, I became the only white man that, to their knowledge, had ever approached the tribe in this manner. And they sat backs to the wall, and I talked, stopping occasionally so my words could be repeated in Cherokee. And when it was over, I was taken from that council hut, emotionally drained, and the door closed. About an hour later, word came. They weren't all in agreement, but one of those supporting the idea of a documentation was Kituwa Chief William Smith. According to their bylaws, the chief has the power to settle any differences among the councilmen. So, permission was granted to bring in cameras. Again, we would break new ground, recording for the first time not a tourist attraction or a reproduction, but the actual worship service of the Kituwa Society. There is already a compelling attractiveness here, always in anticipation of some coming event, and when members gather, the clock is turned back. Sternly conservative, they cling to what's termed the old ways. We arrived the 4th Saturday in August around mid-morning, It would be many months, though, before we learned that two ceremonies of major importance and older than the state of Oklahoma had already occurred. The official lighting of this holy fire and the smoking of the pipe to bless the grounds. By allowing us the luxury of a late arrival, the elders had already started our educational process. Moving at their pace and in their wisdom, they would give us small amounts of information at a time, making sure that each time a page was turned, we understood exactly what was being offered. The basics would begin this day.
How people got here, one of them was Trail of Tears. But before that, my great-grandpa, which name was Little Pig, had left 3 years before the Trail of Tears. He knew that far ahead what was going to take place. Talked to the people. It was already gone too far. Divided. People were divided, disagreeing. But the few people that believed him and followed him, it came with him. 3 years before the Trail of Tears and stopped at Van Buren. He kept this religious and all the bylaws with him. And he was already here when Trail of Tears come to this. The rest of them was roving here.
Chief William Smith, the official spokesman, would become our teacher for the next year and a half. As we talked, a game seldom seen anymore was underway. But here, it's not only a tradition, it's part of the bylaws.
Stickball game, the main folks use their sticks. They're not allowed to use their hand. And the women use their hand. And they got a wooden fish up on top of that pole. Anytime either side hits that fish, counts 7 points. And anytime each side hits the pole above the mark, it counts 1 point. And there ain't no numbers to keep the score, play this game. They mark a line from a pole to the far mount. It had been changed so the young kids can get in and play. Back in my young days, when you was 14 or 10, you couldn't get in it. It was rough. They played rough. Our district chiefs had been instructed to pass on. Whoever they tell to instruct the ball players is play friendly and nice way they could play. And fun. No madness, not to outdo one another, to get mad. It's just peaceful, friendly play. The only reason we don't play now, when I get in it, they can't catch me. That's the reason why they get so mad at me. I just got to stay out of it.
It was during this visit we again heard talk of artifacts. Now, generally speaking, a great many American Indian artifacts are found in museums. Others, stolen many years ago, were sold on the black market for a high price. Those remain lost forever to whatever tribe once held them. But it seemed that Chief Smith was set to begin another phase of our education. Out of a plain brown paper sack, this pipe, handed down through generations of Catawba chiefs.
It's made out of blue stone rock, seemed like to me. And I don't dare to chip it to find out what it's made out of.
One could only wonder how it was formed. How many hours were spent cutting or carving out the bowl? What methods were used? What tools?
It would be something to look back how people made stuff like that way back in days.
The first artifact, but still another mystery. And now questions begin to form. Are there other artifacts? And if so, what are they and where? Well, these arbors could almost qualify. The Catawbas are composed of 7 clans. Each arbor represents a clan. It is said that in their beginning, 7 Catawba medicine men prayed and fasted for 7 days and nights, asking the Great Spirit to give them guidance. On the 7th night, the Great Spirit told them, "You shall be known as Catawba." That God then spoke to them, saying, "The Catawba is to be the chief tribe among the American Indians." The medicine men carried that back to the clans, and it remained the basis of their religion. But there is no other known meaning for the tribal name. The arbors are repaired from time to time, but they still house members of the 7 clans during the various meetings. Then there's the fire, the center of the grounds. It is over this fire that sermons are preached, prayers are spoken. Once it's lit and prayed over, and the pipe smoked, the grounds become a holy place. The fire burns in the center of 4 large logs.
Represents each corner of the world, one end to the another, all the way across. White path, white cross. They represent white roads.
Each log in the direction of true north, south, east, and west. Now, a fire just seems to pose a natural attraction for small children with sticks. But Kituwa children avoid this one, and they're taught very early to respect it as a holy place. Not once in all of our visits did we see a child violate that rule. Before leaving that afternoon, I tried to spend as much time with Chief Smith and the others as possible, knowing that there were other questions that I needed to ask, but still not sure what they were, or where these men, wise in the old ways, were pointing me. That night, they would be dancing, starting late and ending much later. We were invited to stay, but our cameras weren't. What we saw that night opened a door to the past, beyond which would lie the key to not only some of the questions that I needed to ask, but the hint of many answers, and the promise of major artifacts until now withheld from the white world. Those artifacts, the equivalent of ancient secrets, and protected by a security system that would never be understood in the white world. In order to shoot any nighttime activities, we needed lights. But there was the distinct possibility of alienating all who worshipped here. There's electricity for the water pump and for scattered light bulbs hung a few years ago for the safety of the young ones. But again, permission was needed to add a few more lights, and the answer would be weeks in coming. So we waited. Taking advantage of the time, we scheduled an interview with Ross Swimmer, Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation. An attorney with numerous business interests, Swimmer first began representing the nation in 1971. He became their attorney in 1972. Then in 1975 ran for and was elected to the post he now holds, Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation.
The feeling that you have, or that I have, as I walk into the place is one of reverence, that I am in a place of worship. There is talk of the Creator. There are very many things that are talked about that I as a Christian identify with. As I tell the folks there, I look at the Kituwa Society as being the religious arm of the tribe, of the Cherokees. 2 things have impressed me very much about the members of the society. One is that a fellow member in need of help is generally helped without question. If it requires, as I mentioned, this elderly fella, not a member of the society, but if they have an elderly member of the family that needs to be taken care of, instead of taking them to a nursing home, someone moves in with them, even though the guy might live in a very, what we'd call a very poor condition. I will leave my nice 3-bedroom comfortable home and I will move to Vian and live with him until he's gone. That's my responsibility as a member of that family, and I'm not giving up anything. It's just that I have these things, but they're not important to me. What's important is the family, it's the feelings of the elder, it's the person there. Instead of uprooting him from his natural habitat, from his society, and forcing this older person into a hostile environment of a nursing home or whatever, I will move my family to him, and we'll stay there, and we'll take care of them. The second thing is the desire for an education that, almost without question, the leadership and the organization and the members have an apparent very strong desire for education. Most of the families that I'm acquainted with have college degrees and some advanced degrees, and this is something I think the American people generally don't understand. They look at what would be perceived as a primitive religion among the Indian people, and will make an assumption that, well, they are doing this because they're basically uneducated and don't understand the modern world. If they really were educated and understood Christianity like we do, they would all become Christians. This is not true.
Nothing is rushed here. The elements flow at a natural pace. Our wait stretched into weeks. Finally, word came. We could add the necessary lights and shoot the stomp dance. Permission came just in time for one of the biggest events on the Katuha calendar, the September or annual meeting on Labor Day weekend, when members would come from all over the country to reaffirm their faith and embrace their heritage. Then I was told of the lighting of the official fire, a ceremony that would take place in the early morning hours before the official meeting, another ancient ceremony about to be revealed. At sundown the night before, we began the job of arranging the lights and microphones. Photographers Johnny Thomason and Mark Wilson worked throughout the night, moving the lights to just the right position, adding whatever wiring was needed, taping, checking camera positions, running checks and double checks. Because we only had one chance to videotape this, no more night shooting would be allowed. Finally, we settled in to wait the arrival of the firekeeper and his assistant. The moon was high in the Oklahoma sky, the air cool and crisp when they pulled in, and began a ritual that's been handed down from generation to generation. The process you're about to see is thought to date back to the 1500s, and even though it's still used today, this is the first time it's ever been recorded. Firekeeper Jim Hakem and his assistant began the task with small slivers of dry wood. More is cut as we watched. Not a word was spoken as the two men worked. From the innermost part of an oak tree, the section referred to here as the sponge, some flint and some rock, and these items together will trigger the spark. A few feet away, his assistant worked on the medicine fire. The process here is the same. Then suddenly, the fire springs to life. Holding with tradition, a small sacrifice, in this case, a small piece of beef or chicken. Then, the pipes are lit from the fire, and prayers for direction and guidance follow. This ground is now sacred, a church with no walls, and the fire must burn until the services end. The firekeeper does his job so well, he'll be able to leave and not come back until much later in the day, and the fire will still glow. The medicine fire is left to the assistant, but the same rules apply. Here, medicine men will bring in pre-assigned roots or herbs to add to a boiling mixture. But we weren't able to tape it because they add those ingredients only when no one is watching. Sunrise would find me, along with the firekeeper and Chief Smith's brothers, near the medicine fire talking, trading stories about politics or the weather or anything but the actual events we had just witnessed, almost as though they'd never happened. Later in the morning, the women, including the chief's wife, Eva May, descend in the cooking area to get ready for the day's big noon meal. Only those in their menstrual cycle or pregnant are not allowed to help. As children play and the men gather to talk or just watch, these women begin building a feast from the very best in old-fashioned country food. All fresh, all cooked right here. From fried chicken to cherry pies.
Brown beans, we had fried potatoes, we had fried pork, boiled pork, Indian cornbread, they call those blue dumplings. Like cornbread with brown beans in it. And they had all kinds of pies, all kinds of cakes. I couldn't name, and I always fix some gravy. They like milk gravy or water gravy. And then make homemade biscuits, and then we always make a cornbread and salad, and iced tea, coffee, and Kool-Aid, stuff like that. And I guess that's about all.
I felt like a small boy at his mother's knee. It brought back memories of my childhood, another kitchen from another time.
And I imagine you know what these are, Sam.
Oh, yeah.
Brown beans. That reminds me, we gotta pick some onions too. Oh, now you wanted that piece. That's how come I dropped it.
That was my piece.
He's starving. Let's hurry up and take it all.
Got it? Yeah. Just away from the fire. Right here, be all right. Well, he'd make a good Indian, wouldn't he?
You sure would. You're a part Indian, aren't you? Yeah.
Meanwhile, west of the fire mound, another round of stickball is underway, and the players easily work up a big appetite. Chief Smith said the sticks used in the games haven't changed much over the years.
Well, they get the hickory and they whittle it out and the way the shape so they can bend that in the spoon shape. And they drill a hole and put a net on there to hold the ball. Sometimes they use hot water to heat that wood so they can bend it the way they want to.
Women and children have the advantage. You see, the men have to use the sticks to pick up and throw the ball. But the women are allowed to use their hands, and they do use their hands. At last, the call to eat. But first, there's prayer, led by Chief Smith's brother, Junior. Thanks given to God for good health and good food, and most important, for direction given to the Katuhwa.
During that September meeting, well, we asked the guys to eat first, and then we have another table for the kids, and then us women eat last. We always try to get the men folks to eat first and the kids, and then we come last. Just as many as we can get on that big table.
Some eat here, near the table. Others will carry their food back to their family camps. And there might be one or two others who, away from the camera, will demonstrate a healthy appetite.
No, we didn't watch it. It was a shame to watch it. No, we don't watch people. But we can just imagine, though, how much they eat, because everything tasted so good when it's cooked on those 2 wood-burning cook stoves, and because you were hungry. Well, they say if you drop something, somebody's watching you, that they're hungry. So that's what happened. You was hungry.
Again and again, we watched as history lived right in front of us. For now, this is the center of the universe for the Katuhwas, as it was hundreds of years ago in another place. Later, there are afternoon sermons. Tribal leaders will deliver their sermons in Cherokee, telling the people to follow the way of the Katuhwa, to walk the path set out for them by God, and warnings not to stray from their teachings, and finally, to love all mankind. When it is over, members respond. In our world, the response might be interpreted as Amen. Later that night, we would again go back in time to record part of the heritage of this tribe, the stomp dance and the smoking of the pipe. Meanwhile, we are again told of the mysterious artifacts, and we spend the rest of the daylight left to us wondering what tonight will bring. The last traces of sunlight are gone now, and the temperature begins to drop. Throughout the grounds, there are scattered pockets of families gathered near small fires for warmth. A quiet sense of anticipation can be felt throughout, as this fall moon provides the sort of glow that gives life to old dead trees late at night. Finally, the pipe is lit, and it's 1600 again. By clan, the others then file in to take 7 puffs on this old pipe. Finally, this portion of the ceremony is over. Now come prayers and sermons.
Nawajan the youth tonight, the Lagueti, who y'all know not start there.
Then a collection is taken, money to pay for some of today's food and to help those in need. Careful, detailed records of all financial transactions are maintained by Chief Smith. If necessary, he can provide any of those records from any portion of his term as chief. At this point, the chief and the elders and medicine men hold an informal business meeting. As of now, these sacred grounds are blessed. The Ketuhwa have come together as called for in a belief handed down over many generations. The mood is immediately relaxed and light. They would tolerate our lights tonight as the call came for the first dance. Then the second call. The first dance is by invitation. Tribal officers, elders, medicine men, and clan heads are first called in.
The clan wolf is on the south side of the far. Then you go round, next one will be what they call a bear. The third one will be deer. Fourth one is a war paint. And the fifth one is birds. And sixth one, which we call long hair, which represents lion. And the seventh one is Savannah, which I belong to.
Now, others may join the line, and some do. But as expected, the bright lights are not accepted all that well. Even so, they will eventually answer the other calls to dance. For now, a night of celebration, fellowship, and spiritual cleansing is underway. This drum is the only instrument. In fact, the Ketuhwa bylaw states, it shall be forbidden to mix the fiddle dance with anything which is done for the Ketuhwa purpose. Shackles are as traditional as the dance. Worn on the legs of women, they provide a strong rhythm.
They're made out of turtles. You get your turtle and you kill it and then clean it out. Then drill holes in it after you get through cleaning it real good. And then you find certain kind of rocks. And then you put maybe a handful in each one. And then tie a string around it and hang it up in a dry place. And then you wait for them to get dry. And then you take 13 for one shackle. 13 shells for one shot. So you have to have 26 for a whole pair. Then you get an old boot top or some kind of leather, and then you put your turtle shells on there, run a wire through there to hold them on there. Then after you get 13 on there, well, you get a strip of leather, and then you put them around there to keep them in place so they won't rattle all the time.
During a later conversation at the Smith home, Eva Mae Smith talked with me about the shackles and how she was taught to make them.
I learned it from my mother. She used to make shackles a long time ago. She probably learned it from her parents.
And they are heavy.
When you wear them, it's like wearing leg weights. In fact, a shuffle step is necessary to avoid tiring too quickly, especially during hot weather. This dance will continue until the early morning hours. There is no age barrier. In fact, you'd think the pace would be too demanding for the elderly, but each dance only seems to create a thirst for more.
Well, they always told us, if you anticipate, like playing ball, and then dance like that, well, that's where you get your energy. You don't get old like some people. We have some people that don't even play ball, don't even dance, and they act like they're 90 years old.
I generally don't participate in the stomp dance itself because I feel like that is something that is, it's almost their communion, it's their worship. And I'm not a member of it. I have an appreciation for it. I love the people very much there, and I'm fascinated by their belief and the fact that they hold it very strongly and know that it must be right, as is mine and as is many others as far as the religion is concerned. So it does strike me as being very much a religious society.
The music from these dances would stay with us long after we left the grounds. Chief Smith told us that the real meaning of the words to the songs can't be translated. They were handed down from generation to generation long before the Sequoia alphabet, and over the many years, the real meaning was lost. Now they're used in a spirit of fellowship and celebration. Well, as the energy level of the dance increased, so did the efforts of photographers Johnny Thomason and Mark Wilson. Just after midnight, Chief Smith, his brother Crosland, a high medicine man, and some of the others talked with me about their artifacts. Wampum belts that would hold the same significance for Katuhas as the Dead Sea Scrolls do for many in the white world. Belts that are only brought out for members to see during special occasions. Sometimes, as William and Crosland spoke, it was difficult for me to follow their thought line or their course of information. But again, there was a reason.
And they also give it to you in a very veiled way sometimes. It's through stories and events that are described, in which you have to pick out the substance of those stories and figure out what they're talking about, because they don't really give you a real straight answer up front. They want you to think about it. And I know in talking with William, I've had the same feeling sometimes that you'll be talking along and suddenly realize that you're not fully understanding what he says, and you try to think about it, and at first it doesn't make sense until you do think about it.
Well, at this point, I was thinking about it. And on this night, my education would continue by way of stories and legends. Chief Smith wanted me to understand exactly what the belts actually mean to the people. For the time being, they would not be shown in our presence until the elders felt we were ready. Chief Smith said we were not the first to try this documentation. He said they'd already turned away at the Smithsonian and numerous television networks, newspapers, and any number of writers and photographers. But he said that according to Kituwa legend, when the time is right in this world and when leaders of other nations and other governments are in disagreement, a white man with blue veins would tell the Kituwa story. He felt that prophecy was now being fulfilled, for he said I was the first white man to sit in council to request permission to tell their story. And he said it was given.
As of tonight, almost all of their ceremonies were committed to videotape, but it would be a year before the belts were shown to us. Now, I'd be back here many times, and several times with my family as my education continued. In the summer of 1983, we came here to the Redbird Smith Cemetery. Located near Lake Tinkiller, it is an Indian burial ground for several families, all members of the Kituwa faith. Redbird Smith, recognized as a chief of great wisdom and knowledge, and the man responsible for reshaping of the tribe after the Trail of Tears. Many others were marked by natural stones with Cherokee script. A great deal of history rests here. Katuhwazu helped write the pages of that history. We disturb nothing, taking with us only the silent images of this peaceful setting. July 19th is a major holiday. It marks the birthday of Redbird Smith, who members also say possessed a very strong belief in God. In addition, Sequoia's birthday isn't known, so it's celebrated as well this time. Their pictures, along with pictures of Chief Smith's father, are hung on the east side of the fire. There's a day of stickball, dinner on the ground, sermons, and a night of dancing, in the best Kituhwa tradition. Then, almost a year and a half after my first visit with the council, word came. The Belts and their meetings would be waiting on a Saturday afternoon here, at Chief Smith's home, which he built himself in the Cookson Hills of Oklahoma. The Belts had been delivered to his home that morning, and he had them on display for us, hanging on a wall, made up of hundreds of thousands of very small pieces of hollow coral, and according to the chief, the twine or leather bindings are original. Although they don't appear to be, each is heavy, 10 to 15 pounds, and for the next 3 hours, each was carefully explained.
You have your mind clean, pure, love, then you are fallen in this line. Stands for the 7 clans of Balaw, a small organization Balaw, in the name of God. Each knot of these represents the clans, and the way we see the color, that's how white and how clean and healthy it's supposed to be. The next belt would represent about the tomahawk was used. They were bloody and dirty and dangerous. But when the treaty of peace was signed with the people, that's what this means. They're not bloody. Means all white. If you follow the bylaw instruction of these belt, the rules, regulation, your mind, your heart, your body should be clean as it's white, it's the way it is.
With each a meaning, a reason to live and walk the path of the Kituhwa. As he talked, the message became very clear. This is their original Bible, the way set in coral and twine, carefully woven and tied. Then, in the hand of Sequoia, the Kituhwa Commandments.
That means we belong to that in there, the way he says. We belong to God. And it's Israel. God is Israel son. Israel belonged to God.
Now I understood why he waited so long before showing us the belts, why he made sure that their meaning was clear, no hidden messages. I suddenly felt as though a bond had developed between us, unspoken because words weren't necessary. His gift to me, the simplicity of his faith. Mine in return to tell this story based on his truth. In other words, this is a look at the Kituhwa faith as it now lives. You don't have to accept or reject. Just understand that for members, it's all that's needed. The message would carry more meaning for me when the belts were again shown to the people, and the elders knew that. Later, on the front porch, he talked of the medicine and the legends behind it.
A medicine is benefit for people, illness, and to help people in order to survive and get by safely. Everything we see on earth, it's used for something good, to benefit, as well as something that's poison, like poison ivy, that could be used for something.
He talked to me of Indian cures for everything under the sun. For instance, a major problem for folks in the city.
It depends on what kind of cold. There's different kind of cold, you know. Could be on kind of effect of summer cold. Winter cold, we use sometimes it's on account of a cold, infection, having a flu or bad cold ache. Could be used by heating, by fire. Or you can make a a tea that they will drink warm. Or different types of weed that you make and boil it and drink it. And there are other medicine that could be used for heat, fever. That's one thing I'm familiar with. A lot of people have called it goat weed. Make a tea and drink it cold. Will cool your system down and will turn the fever down.
But medicine alone is not enough. Prayers and songs in Cherokee. The final ingredient, of course, is faith. Faith in God and the medicine. The results caught us by surprise. For instance, Ross Swimmer was told he had lymphatic cancer. He finished the prescribed treatments in Houston, and the results were positive. But then he went to Crosland Smith for the medicine.
I certainly had no reason to do it simply as a symbolic gesture. I wouldn't have taken the medicine if it were, if I knew that it was just symbolic, so to speak. I had some idea that they, just of my own knowledge, know that most or many contemporary medicines are derived from the natural medicines that the Indians developed years ago. And Crosland and the folks there certainly have a handle on those medicinal roots and herbs and things, and very well might have a lot of the answer to common illnesses that a lot of those roots and herbs and things have been synthesized into drugs today and combined with some other chemicals that make them more potent, but they still serve the same purpose. I guess as far as the chemotherapy is concerned, most of those chemicals are artificially developed now, but the medicines of the past, and in fact, in my ancestry, one of the swimmers was a medicine man and wrote a book on what was then, a couple hundred years ago, contemporary Cherokee medicines, and listed all the herbs and the roots and the mushrooms and everything else that were used medicinally, and many of those are, in fact, extracted today and used in everyday medicines. So, I was fairly confident that it certainly wasn't going to hurt me, and if anything, it might, hold some of the secret to helping.
3 different things that I use just passed on to me that could be used. Weeds, one of them, it comes to the point of we call it the yellow root. It's to be made